The trees. The trees are coming into leaf, like something almost being said. The recent buds relax and spread. Their greenness is a kind of grief. Is it that they are born again and we grow old? No. They die too. Their yearly trick of looking new is written down in rings of grain. Yet still the unresting castles thresh, in full-grown thickness, every May. Last year is dead, they seem to say. Begin afresh, afresh, afresh. It's a beautiful, beautiful morning here in northeast Hampshire, which is where I'm lucky enough to be able to call my home. I'm also very lucky that about 5 minutes walk from my front door there are 3 big fields, and at the very bottom of one runs the small River Whitewater. And though our rivers have been in the news for all the wrong reasons recently, it's very soothing to listen to the sound of the trickling water as it goes through here. And to paint a bit of a picture with words, in front of me I can see huge, huge trees overbearing each side of the bank, fully bloomed with their full complement of green leaves. And overhead, as you can hear, a distant plane flies. We're often told, and in fact there is a sign near me that's all about being mindful and being at one with nature, giving advice on breathing exercises and listening to the sound of the water. And my dog is taking it very literally and decided to go in for a dip. Well done, boy. Try not to drag me in with you, please. Donut. I'm very, very fortunate to live in a nice place like this. And it often makes me wonder what it must be like if you don't have nature on your doorstep or you're not able to travel to it easily. Because one of the things I've always been fascinated with as I've gotten older is the effect that it does have on my mental health. Especially when the summer comes around. I'm a winter baby, born in February, and I used to always think that led me a predisposition to disliking summer. I found it too hot and too difficult and too stifling. And yeah, I don't like it when it's too hot or anything like that. But there's something about a day like today, where the weather's going to be in the early 20s, the sun's going to be out, opportunities to get out on the bike, possibly go and watch some cricket and maybe even have a drop of beer on a Sunday. That's the stuff dreams are made of. And it got me thinking about every year, every summer, as it rolls around. And the poem I'm going to be doing for you today is The Trees, which is one of my favourite poems of Philip Larkin's, and one that I return to each year afresh. Now, a bit of personal disclosure. In 2022, on this day, my lovely father was rushed to hospital, having had a cardiac arrest. It was something that he would not recover from, and he sadly died about a week and a half later. We all hoped for his recovery, and it never happened. He was a lovely, lovely man, and I think about him every day, but I especially think of him at this time of year. I can't quite believe it's only been 2 years since we said goodbye to him. And it's why this poem feels more poignant to me than ever before. It's a good job that I've gone out and done this on my dog walk, because I couldn't really take my copy of the collected poems with me. But what I could do, and what I've always been able to do with this poem, is thankfully I've been able to do it from memory from quite a young age. It helps that the poetic form is incredibly tight and straightforward in a way, even though, like a lot of Larkin's great poems, the rhyme is not immediately obvious. And when you read this one through and you see just how tight it is, and these beats throughout the stanzas really just bring home how wonderful a work it is. I think it's fair to say that The Trees is obviously one of the closer poems that we get to a metaphysical Larkin, looking at the idea of what life and death really is, but explored through nature. Maybe not quite through the sublime, but definitely through the concept of everyday beauty, these trees, these unresting castles that we take for granted, trees that will be there long before and long after we have gone. And this idea that you could be wandering through all these beautiful sort of forests and sort of glades and see these trees, and like all things in nature, humans, we take them for granted. The felling of the sycamore gap tree, I think, really gave us all as a nation a bit of a jolt this past year, to think, how could somebody commit such a wantonly brazen act of destruction for no purpose? And yet trees are felled all the time, all over the world, when they shouldn't have been. So again, returning to looking at Larkin through a bit of an eco lens, it's there. You could say it's projection, but there's always a way of looking at a poem in a different period of time. In terms of what the poem means to me, I've always loved the way that this poem just builds. The anticipation, the trees are coming into leaf. It's a strange phrase, coming into leaf. And that beautiful second line, like something almost being said. There's a hint of, is it like a whisper? Do we want to believe that summer is nearly here, that spring has properly started? Certainly 2024 has been a year of just constant rain. I felt like 2023 was very similar. And yet when it does arrive, it arrives almost full-voiced. So the almost being said is quite symbolic. You know, we daren't say it. We daren't say, oh, summer's here, because we all know there's the curse of the British barbecue weather, where we all go, oh, it's here finally, and then bang, rain for another 3 weeks. We sort of had that a few weeks ago, I would definitely argue. And then the recent buds relax and spread. Their greenness is a kind of grief. The alliterative G sound there, I think, adds something very pleasing, and yet we've got this wonderful juxtaposition of greenness with the idea of new and approaching something, but then with the concept of grief, the idea that it's the end. And yet I've always started, certainly recently, to take that to mean that the grief is that another year has gone. There's another year, another round of this cycle. And again, like a lot of Larkin images, he likes to not really commit fully. It's a kind of grief. It's almost a simile. And we get that question, is it that they are born again and we grow old? No. Puts a stop to that pretty quickly. No. They die too. Their yearly trick of looking new is written down in rings of grain. It's a bit of a constant theme with Larkin to keep coming back to the idea of a trick or an illusion. I always think of that line in Or Bard when he says about the vast moth-eaten musical brocade about religion, saying that, you know, there are real things in this world that will happen, and there are things that won't, or maybe will pretend to. And the less deceived of us will always be able to tell the difference. Larkin, of course, I think in this poem is very quick to say, no, there's no magic to trees. They just live longer than us. They have a longer lifespan. If we let them, they'll live for hundreds of years, whereas we won't. But of course, that's too prosaic even for him, I think. So to say, no, their yearly trick of looking new is written down in rings of grain. It's the idea of saying, well, if you actually cut a tree down, you can definitely see how old it is. But then, of course, you've cut it down and you've got rid of it. It's the concept of the magical box that will change your life. All you got to do is look inside. But the magic of it is that you never look inside, because by doing so, you take away the magic. Then we get the unresting castles. A strange metaphor. Unresting castles. The constant idea that these things are huge and sentinel-like. they loom over us. I'm just walking underneath a absolutely magnificent oak tree, and if you really stop and think about how long it's been there and how many countless people have stood in its shade on a hot day or sheltered from rain underneath it. And this one's actually surrounded by a wooden fence. It's in someone's back garden. God, wouldn't want to have to deal with that. And then we get to the final part of this poem, which, for me, it doesn't matter how many times I read it, I always get a little bit of gooseflesh. There's something very, very beautiful, very timeless, very un-Larkin, really, in some ways, in that it gives you a sense of hope, but feeling fairly undiluted. Last year is dead, they seem to say. There's that non-committal approach again. Begin afresh, afresh, afresh. I used to do this to my students. Note the 2, not 4, because I take any advantage of a captive audience. I used to read it with the poem behind me on the board so that they could see I was definitely reading it correctly. It put a bit of pressure on me. But I wanted them to realise that actually by repeating a line or a word, it can increase its power. Repetition is an underused tool in poetry. It's incredibly easy to do, but like a lot of things, very difficult to do well. And that phrase "afresh" is a just delicious word in the context of this poem, but also generally this idea of new starts. And if we were to apply any sort of biographical aspect here, we could talk about Larkin's fresh starts in Oxford, Belfast, Leicester, and of course finally settling in Hull. But that desire to move anew and to start again, and like the tree, stay in one place, but change for the better, or at the very least, not die. And it's something that I think whenever my dad and I would talk about poetry, and he wasn't a man that loved that sort of thing necessarily, but he, for a working class bloke from Preston, he read a lot. And I think when I got interested in English literature, he was very interested in my interests. Although he did think Larkin was, quote unquote, a miserable sod, which I don't think is too far off the mark. But it takes one to know one, Dad. The other part of it that I remember when we talked about this poem once and I'd sort of read it to him, he said, that last line's pretty immortal, isn't it? It could apply to anyone at any time, going through anything. And I think when it comes to that grief that you feel, even on a sunny day, even when the trees are blowing in the wind and everything looks beautiful and bucolic, and yet there's a shadow and a chill in your heart because all you can think about are the people that have gone and aren't there to enjoy it with you. Nothing to be done except to begin afresh.